Buddhist philosophy speaks of the four invisibles: water to the fish, air to the bird, mind to mankind, and enlightenment to the ignorant. Because, you see, you never know your own element. It's impossible, therefore, to give a definition of consciousness because we don't know anything outside it. Just as the fish doesn't know anything outside water, and the bird doesn't know anything outside air, we don't know unconsciousness. We only know when we have been unconscious. And so, we are in a very difficult position when we attempt to define the subject of this seminar. We all know what it is, and yet none of us know what it is. We know we are conscious. It's the same sort of problem as trying to say what color your eyes are. I don't mean whether they're blue or brown, but the color of the iris, the lens of the eye. We say it has no color. It's transparent, like pure glass. Yet, that might be a color to someone with a different kind of eye. An Englishman and a Hindu were once sitting in the backyard of the Hindu's home. The Hindu was talking about the necessity of a background for the perception of any figure. So, he asked, "Against what background do you see those flowers?" The Englishman replied, "Against the background of the hedge." "And against what background do you see the hedge?" the Hindu asked. "The background of the hills," said the Englishman. "And against what background do you see the hills?" "The background of the sky," came the answer. "And against what background do you see the sky?" The Englishman fell silent. The Hindu said, "It's the background of consciousness." There, you see, we reach a limit. You can talk endlessly about whether consciousness and reality are the same thing, whether there truly is such a thing as pure unconsciousness, whether consciousness is a tunnel or, as subjective idealists in philosophy might argue, whether all physical and material existence exists only in the mind or in consciousness. You can debate that subject forever and come out nowhere. There is no answer to the question when asked in that way, but it's helpful as a start to simplify things, and perhaps make them a little more complex, by overcoming the traditional opposition between the spiritual and the material or the mental and the material. We do this by talking about all things, whether spiritual or physical, in terms of pattern, because that's really all we can talk about. Pattern. It's fundamental to our common sense, influenced by Aristotle and the Book of Genesis, that all forms are composed of some substance, just as sculptures are made of stone, or pots are made of clay. But a serious physicist no longer thinks in such terms about the material world. They don't think it's made of anything. What the physical process of nature is patterns. You could say patterns of energy, but that uses the old ceramic language. Patterns aren't made of energy. The patterning is the energy. So, if you think of the universe as patterning, you'll have something tangible to discuss. Patterns can be described, measured, and observed. A pattern isn't a thing. It's a verb, a process, an activity. Thus, patterning is what's happening, and consciousness, as we'll see, is a kind of patterning. Just as flowers, human beings, stars, trees, water, and everything else are patterns. Even space itself is a form of patterning. This means, in other words, that the universe is what physicists call an energy field. Likewise, consciousness is a field. Space is clearly a field, an area in which things happen. That's the primary meaning of field. A field is like an arena, a place where activity occurs. In physics, though, a field refers to forces like a magnetic field or a gravitational field. What's curious about fields is that they operate in a non-mechanical way. For example, if gravity were not a field, if it worked like mechanical energy such as heat transfer, then placing a heavy lead plate on the ground would absorb gravitational energy. Anything placed atop the plate would feel less gravity. But that doesn't happen. Gravity's strength remains unchanged, no matter how much mass is added. Similarly, consider an electrical coil surrounding a plastic tube. Passing a current through the coil creates a field inside the tube. Your hand inside the tube feels nothing, but if you insert steel, the coil polarizes it, generating heat. The field operates without physical push and pull. Now, think of the world as a field characterized by patterning, which, by another name, is energy. Consciousness must be treated in a similar way. One characteristic of all energy or patterning is that we often understand it through spectrums. For example, there's the light spectrum from red to violet. Beyond the visible spectrum lies an invisible range. infrared, ultraviolet, gamma rays, cosmic rays, and so on. Similarly, there's a sound spectrum, and we might imagine a spectrum of taste if a scientist of cookery devised one. There are spectra of shapes, emotions, and vibrations. For instance, consider a spectrum of love. At one end, let's call it red, is lust or Freudian libido. At the other, violet, lies divine love or charity. In between, we have greens, friendship, endearment, and so on. Every emotion might have its own spectrum. The world, in essence, is an interlocking of spectra, a weaving of patterns. Think of weaving. You have warp and weft threads crossing to form a pattern. Pull out one, and the cloth unravels. Both are needed for any pattern to exist. Similarly, take a photograph in a newspaper. Viewed closely, it's just a collection of dots, some light, some dark. Yet, from a distance, those dots form a face. What's the relationship between the form of the face and the grid of dots? At first glance, none. The same grid can produce any face. The grid itself seems irrelevant to the specific form. This passage explores a fascinating analogy between various systems, radios, music, consciousness, and dimensions, to discuss the relationship between medium and message, as well as the nature of interconnectedness in the universe. Here's a concise breakdown. The radio analogy. The radio's physical mechanics, transistors, wiring, are separate from the music or content it delivers. Similarly, understanding the brain's anatomy may not fully explain thought or consciousness. This draws on Marshall McLuhan's idea that the medium is the message, suggesting the medium itself influences perception as much as the content does. Interdependence of systems. The analogy extends to how a piano's structure enables music, but doesn't dictate what is played. Similarly, consciousness and the brain interlock like warp and woof, creating a pattern that depends on both components. Spectra and dimensions. The discussion broadens to describe the universe as an interlocking web of spectra, light, sound, emotional, etc., and dimensions. Each spectrum or dimension is distinct but inherently part of the same whole, much like lines, surfaces, and points in geometry. Selective perception. Just as a harp or piano requires selective string plucking to create music, human perception filters and selects from the vast spectrum of stimuli. This selective process is compared to the harp of creation, where consciousness shapes the universe through focused attention. Spectrum of consciousness. Consciousness is depicted as a spectrum, ranging from the dullness of dreamless sleep to its brightest states. This spectrum, though inherently selective, contributes to the larger interconnected whole of existence. The overall message delves into the profound interconnectedness of the physical and mental realms, challenging the binary thinking of spiritual versus material and framing existence as a harmonious, multidimensional symphony. Number 2 is tapas, as in the state of going to sleep or being under the influence of alcohol. You feel no pain at all, or your sort of investment ties down your senses. $1 in blood, and you don't feel like being very active. 3. Waking consciousness. Only I have to qualify this because the others are awake too. But I mean our normal, everyday consciousness, which we're going to call symbolic. And I'll explain why as we go through these in detail. Number 4. Sensory consciousness. Number 5. Cellular. Number 6. Molecular. Number 7. We will just give the name light to it. Now, I want to make it perfectly clear that these names I've used are not claiming to be exact scientific terms. They are simply suggestive. We do not yet have a science of consciousness in the Western sense of the term. That doesn't exist. And that's one of the things we shall eventually have to develop. So, these names are more symbolic than scientific, and you must keep that in mind. Now, it's rather interesting that this particular spectrum should best be drawn, not in the usual way as a simple band, but as a circle. In this circle, each of these is, as it were, a slice of the pie. Beyond here, you arrive again at sleep, deep sleep, dreamless sleep. The Hindus have a way of classifying the states of consciousness which isn't quite the same as this. They start out with the waking state, the dreaming state, the dreamless state, Turiya, which simply means the fourth, and cannot be described. They would say that when you go to bed at night, you sink first into the dreaming state. Then you descend into what they call susupti, the dreamless state, and perhaps you reach turiya. That's why sleep refreshes you, because you, as an individual, are withdrawn into the center of the universe, into the Atman or Brahman, the primordial reality, the ground of being. That's why you are refreshed every night. That's how you get there, you know? Because deep down, the Hindus teach everyone is it. That is to say, the Godhead is playing at being, dreaming up whoever it is you consider yourself to be. Then, at night, when you sleep, you go back to being the undivided, single essence of the universe. When you wake up, you forget about it. Why? Because in the primordial state, there's nothing to remember. There's no time, and you need time for memory to function. So imagine these states as a circle. At the top of the circle, you have number 7, brilliant. Then the colors of consciousness spiral right around, eventually meeting again, black and white side by side at the top. If we describe this in terms of color, all other colors connect around the circle. You see, black and white, as I'll show you later, are astonishingly creative. You can do everything with black and white. Black and white contain all color. This is why the Chinese theory of the universe is based on the opposition of yang and yin, the positive and the negative. The names yang and yin are derived, respectively, from the south and north sides of a mountain. The yang is the bright south side. The yin is the shadowed north side. Now, no one has ever seen a one-sided mountain, right? Can't exist. In the same way, you cannot have yang without yin. The familiar symbol, the black and white interlocking shapes with an opposite-colored eye in each, is profound. It represents yang and yin as interdependent forces, constantly in flux. For instance, the crest of a wave represents yang, while the trough represents yin. You cannot have one without the other. Half a wave does not exist. There's also a pulse, a point where the yang force peaks and begins to transition into yin and vice versa. The Chinese understood this deeply, even applying it to natural and human affairs. A storm, for example, peaks in its yang energy, then subsides into the yin calm. The entire I Ching is based on this dynamic interplay. Now, let me explain this in parenthesis. When you're making a decision, you gather all the facts. But eventually, you reach a point where the facts alone can't help you decide. You might go one way or the other. That's when you flip a coin. A coin, though, offers only 2 possibilities, yes or no. The Chinese developed something far richer. Their coin, the I Ching, offers 64 possibilities, each represented by a hexagram. These hexagrams are built from yin broken and yang unbroken lines. A group of 3 lines forms a trigram, of which there are 8 possible combinations. These trigrams then combine to form 64 hexagrams, representing various situations. For example, this one, 2 yang lines with a yin line in the middle, represents fire. Another, with the inverse pattern, represents water. Together, they express an intricate interplay of forces, guiding decision-making through symbolic interpretation. So, to each of those, the Book of Changes attaches an oracular remark. If you look up the hexagram you've obtained through a certain process, it gives you insight into your decision and the direction it should take, by bringing it out of you through its remarks, much like how a Rorschach blot reveals your psychological disposition. It's as if there were 64 ways of tossing a coin. If you had a 64-sided coin, you could use it that way. If such a thing were possible, and you could probably make one, it would likely be spherical. From yang to yin, from the extremes of polarity, we see that light is as intense and alive as it can get. But if you go too far into light, it will burn you up, and you'll end up in darkness. People often don't realize this, but the farther you go into darkness, the brighter it can become. Because you can't have darkness without light, just as you can't have light without darkness. When we were children, we were never told this. But it's the secret. Light and dark go together. It's the only real secret there is, black and white. However, we've forgotten the secret because we've been playing another game called All Black Must Win. That's what makes life thrilling. If you always knew you'd win, life would lose its excitement. Imagine being in total control of everything, a kind of omnipotent Jehovah-like